walk.
Good.
Do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome.
We did have like, and I don't know if this is up to our discretion, but like, do we like sniff if he's still walking, or
Sure.
like pee if he's walking, or like, do we want him?
Good question. Yeah. So we'll let them go by here real quick. So as far as like sniffing on the walk and all that kind of stuff, I always say I am by no means anti-sniff on the walk. Like, we want him to be able to enjoy himself and be a dog, obviously, right? The problem is a lot of people try to blend everything all together, right? So they'll be like, well, I want you to heel, but if you stop for 2 seconds, it's okay. But if you stop for 5 seconds, it's not okay. And if you go too far ahead, you can't have it. But if you go too far behind, it's fine, et cetera, et cetera. You know what I mean? It's like, it's too gray. It's unpredictable for him, right? So I try to structure my walks in a way where everything can be consistent and predictable for the dog, so he knows how to essentially, quote unquote, like win the game, right? So I always start off with the come command, right? Super focused in. I don't let him go off and sniff things or anything like that. And that just gets him kind of primed up and gets them focused in and works on the mental stimulation and the physical stimulation side of things. Once that looks pretty good, somewhere in the middle of the walk, I'll give him a break, right? I'll tell him, okay, at that point, you're free, dude. Do whatever you want to do, right? I'll pick a spot, let him go sniff around on the grass, go to the bathroom, do all that kind of stuff. And the only rule at that point when he's free is just don't start like freaking out at something, right? If you do, I'm gonna crack you for it, right? But outside of that, have fun, right? From there, I'll end the walk with a little bit of the come command again to make sure once I've given the freedom that I could reel him back in if I need to, right? And as long as you're consistent about enforcing that, and as long as you don't do like 80% of the walk freedom and 20% of the walk structure, then you'll be good to go. I usually try to break it up with like 75-25 or something like that, you know, at least initially as you're kind of working through a lot of these types of issues. And then from there, like with my dogs, like there's a park around the corner from our house, and usually what we'll do is we'll like walk the dogs to the park in the come command. And then once we get there, we let them off leash, let them run around, have a good time. We'll be there for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever. And then we'll walk them back home nicely, you know. So, and did you say that he does a lot of like when people aren't there, does he like bark out the window at stuff a lot?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's going to be one thing, because that's something that happens typically every day, you know. That's something that this week you should be able to get completely under control, and that's going to be a big starting place, because if you figure if he's being like all like intimidating towards people that aren't even in the house, when they come into the house, his behavior is going to be even more intense, right? Okay. So if we could stop it before and basically teach him like people aren't coming in, you don't need to worry about them right now, that'll bring him down a couple notches when we're actually having people come in the house.
Okay,
so.
yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, he goes like crazy if we're like talking to the neighbor in the yard and he sees us.
Sure.
He loses it.
Yep. And those are things I would say are normal initially that dogs will do, but we definitely want to stop them still. And we had to do a lot of that with our personal dogs. It's normal they'll have a little bit of a sense of territorialness of the house, but at our last place we were living in, same deal. We had a couple neighbors that had dogs and stuff, and we had to work on that right away with them. Our new house we're in right now, our neighbor next to us always comes up to the fence and talks to us, and that was a little hard for our new dog initially, and we had to work on that a lot. So.
He would like lose it if we did that at our old house too, like for the feds or like kids next door would talk to him.
The hardest part initially is just being consistent and being able to address it, you know what I mean? Because it's as simple as just being able to give a correction for it when he rehearses the behavior, obviously, and making sure it's motivating enough. But if we're only catching it half of the time that he does the behavior, because dogs are typically opportunists, they're gonna continue trying that, right? So I always say, you know, whether it's for 5 to 7 days, you just make sure anytime he's outside in the yard, he's got the e-collar on, or you do kind of set up mock situations of it where, you know, you ask the neighbor, hey, we're gonna come outside, come out and talk to us by the fence so that we could work on this or something like that, you know? So that you're in a position where you're prepared to address it.
So for those instances, do you just say no and correct it?
Yeah, because
doing like a command?
Exactly, yeah, because we don't want to have to be dependent on giving commands to get the dog to not do it, right? Obviously, we use it in some situations, and we'll get into why we use a bed stay, you know, when guests are coming in and stuff like that, as opposed to just correcting the behavior. But stuff like that, like unwanted behaviors, we want to just inhibit those responses. Like, nobody's messing with you. You don't need to be messing with them, because we want him learning how to make those decisions on his own without the need of our kind of guidance and influence.
That makes sense. Yeah, we did that similar concept, like, he used to chase the cats, so we were just like, did that and he stopped. Exactly,
yeah. And that's the cool thing about, you know, inhibiting unwanted behaviors and stuff like that, is as long as you're consistent and as long as you're motivating about it, it goes away pretty quick. So you have it on all the time in the house. What sorts of things do you find yourself using it for typically?
Well, the problem is that you'll have the collar on the remote.
Yep. Which is normal, right? Yeah, and you know, obviously having it handy is easier, right? Because you're in a position to address it a little bit easier, right? But one big trick that most people don't talk about enough is the fact that we use verbal markers like saying no and stuff to buy us the time where we don't need this in our hand at all times, right? So let's say this thing's over here in the kitchen, on the kitchen counter, something like that, and we're over here in the living room hanging out, and suddenly he starts freaking out at the window at something, right? Most people think one of two things. One, I can't do anything about it because it's in the other room, or they'll tell the dog no, go to get it, and then when they're going to get it, the dog stops and they're like, I missed my opportunity kind of thing, right? The reason why we use markers, right, whether it's a positive marker or a negative marker, is to essentially attach the correction to the behavior so we can buy ourselves latency, right, meaning the time to give the correction. So we're in the living room, remote's in the kitchen over there, he starts freaking out the window at something. As long as I identify that mistake clearly with no, so I tell him no, right, just one time, I don't have to say it 3 times or anything like that. From there, I could take my time going all the way in, getting my remote, making sure the level's high enough, tap, and even if when I give that tap, he's no longer even by the window, he will still know that tap is for whatever he was doing when he heard no. Right? And that is like a game changer for people in this situation because it takes you from, I caught it 50% of the time and he's still trying to get away with it, to as long as that collar's on him and you know where the remote is, you will never miss an opportunity to give your correction for it, meaning it'll go away faster. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's one thing as far as with the, at least the barking out the window or the barking in the yard at stuff. I want you guys to implement right away to make sure that you totally eliminate the behavior, right? And what you're gonna see, this is what always happens, is I tell people to do that and they do that for the first half of the week, then they hit that halfway point and the dog, because they know that correction is coming 10 seconds later, 15 seconds later, when you say no, they're like, oh shit, I should stop, right? And they show a similar response to as if they got corrected for the behavior. So they're like, it's fine, I don't need to give the correction. And then they stop giving the tap because they're like, my no worked perfectly, this is amazing. And I would say, that's great, right? But the goal is not that we say no and the behavior stops. The goal is that the behavior stops altogether so we don't have to say no in the first place. So when we hit that point, that's fantastic, but that just means you need to double down on making sure you still give that correction so you get it the rest of the way there so the behavior gets completely extinguished at that point, right?
If we're outside and he's inside, we can hear him freaking out.
Yep.
Give him a correction.
Yes, so let's say you're outside and you can't hear us, right, when we say no, but I know he's freaking out in the front window at something, I could just tap at that point, and as long as the correction comes at the moment that he's rehearsing the behavior, he'll still know what it's for, right? Yeah, the no marker is just so that if he's no longer rehearsing the behavior, as long as he heard that marker, that he knows what it's for. And then additionally, it helps attach the correction to us, right? Because I don't want to be super contingent on like this thing is what's doing all of the work. I want the dog understanding and respecting me ultimately, right? So if I'm marking with no clearly and he's understanding those markers and I'm developing that kind of like negative association with that word in the first place, the focus is on me, not the tool, right? Okay. So, good work, buddy. No. Place. Good. So prime example right there, I marked with no. As soon as I said that word, he was going back to the bed. I still gave the tap though, and I still reiterated the thing that I wanted him to do in that moment, right? Additionally, we talked about this a little bit last time. Anytime I'm working commands on the leash, so bed stays, down stays, sit stays, stuff like that, when I go back to him, I always want to make sure that I get that leash and then pause for a couple seconds and make sure he's waiting for the release word as opposed to seeing me picking up the leash as the cue to get up, right? Okay.
Like he'll like kind of he'll lay down.
Yep. So that's another thing to, so we got a lot of stuff to work on obviously, so I'm gonna throw a lot of information at you guys today. That's kind of what we really want to start using the bed for, is for those extended, totally chill durations, right? So when I'm working bed stays, I always say I want my clients to be able to get minimum 30 to 45 minutes on the bed, if they need to, right? It's not like you're going to be working that all the time by any means, but we want to know if we need them to, we can. And truthfully, we want them to be able to do longer than that if we need to, but once you hit that 30 to 45 minutes, you can leave them for 2 hours and they're probably going to stay, you know what I mean? And that's because we're working on that overall state of mind. Like right now, he's holding it and he's doing well with it, but he's a little antsy, he's a little stressed out, he doesn't know what's going on, and I want him to start working through those emotions being around a trigger like a person in the house or you know, commotion going on over there or whatever it may be, and I want to see him work through that while keeping 50% of his brain on a task, right? So basically we're telling him, I know you're scared of this person right now, but focus on this thing while you're getting acclimated to that. So instead of having 100% of his brain fixated on it, we have less of that, so he's not going to be as intense about it, right? And what you'll see is once you hit that 30-minute mark, you'll see him totally chill out. And the progression when we have guests come over is guests come in, he may hold it, but he's real wound up. He's like, I don't want to hold it, but he's still staying focused on it, obviously. And we see him go from the whimpering, the whining, maybe a little bit of barking, stuff like that, to him settle down and be in more of an anxious state, to him lay down, to him then put his head down and actually start relaxing. And every time I introduce my dogs to a new person coming in the house, especially if I'm dealing with a dog that has a history of some insecurity issues or aggression issues or anything like that, every time a new person comes over, I want to see them go through that cycle and kind of acclimate to that person from afar before the interaction ever happens, right? Because where most bites happen or negative things happen when people come over is in situations when the dog's in an adrenalized, heightened state of mind. So what this does is combat that a little bit and let him chill out before that interaction takes place so that it can be more productive, right? So again, benchmarks as far as what we want to see with him is we want to see him obviously stop barking out the window at stuff altogether, right? It's not his job to need to like fend off whatever threats that he's perceiving, right? Additionally, we want to see when people come in, our first goal is not interaction. I think a lot of people jump to that right off the rip. Our first goal is neutrality, right? So we need to see that even if it, like twice a month you have people come over the house, we want to see for the next month that those 2 times, maybe he doesn't interact at all with those people, but we see him get into that totally chill headspace on his bed around them, and we end on that and make it super successful. Okay. You know what I mean? And as he starts to realize this is not something I need to be concerned about, then we start moving to the next benchmark, which is him coexisting not in a bed state around the other people, right? So that's kind of...
The other thing that would happen is like, he would be, like I'm thinking of Bill, or like over at my parents' house, like we had our friends come over and he was like fine with them, and then all of a sudden Bill went up to go to the bathroom, he comes down, and now that he comes back.
Yeah, good question, right? So the reason for that, if we really break down why the dog is acting that way, is because we're making it too optional, right? We talked about this a little bit with the walk last time, where why is he sometimes lunging at people, but sometimes holding his position perfectly fine? It's because there's no expectation of we're telling you you have to behave this way. When we start off with the bed stay every time somebody comes over the house, and once you get them really good, like with my dogs, I'll do it for 15 minutes usually. People come over, 15 minutes on the bed, then they're free to hang out kind of thing. When we do that, we're immediately telling them the first time you meet this person, you're not deciding. I'm telling you they're okay. I'm telling you there's nothing to be worried about. We see him get into that chill headspace. Then once we release him, we have him in a totally different state of mind at that point, right? So even though he's physically doing the same thing, which is just coexisting and hanging out and stuff like that, we've worked through all these like emotional hurdles, right? So, like additional rules that we have as far as like when we go to start having him free around the new people, one big rule is no furniture access at that point. I don't care if he's on the furniture with you guys and stuff, that's fine, but when guests are over, it can't happen. It's a super vulnerable position, and if you have a dog that's apprehensive and they're starting to develop this kind of more territorial association with like a plot of furniture or something, you run more of a risk of things happening, you know what I mean? So as far as with the people side of things, that will pretty much address that, right? As far as the cat side of things, if you're noticing that, because I would consider that to be like space guarding, right? That's not that he has an issue with the cat necessarily, but when he's there all comfy on his spot on the couch, he's a little bit more defensive. That might be something that you consider temporarily nixing his access to it depending on how often you're seeing that happen. You know what I mean? What you could try to do first before you do that is just the second you notice him start getting into that like tense, like he's thinking about doing it, big correction for that, right? As soon as you see it, snap him out of that state of mind, right? And see if that helps you out or not.
I never knew if like the correction would make it more angry or like if it would like shut it down.
So good question, right? So everything is contingent on the motivation of it, right? So like let's say that's happening and we correct him at a 3, right? Something that's like just like, hey, you know? Yeah, that could piss him off more because it's naggy, you know what I mean? It's like, it could almost like set them off, right? But if that correction is super motivating, you're gonna just cap that behavior altogether and kind of snap him completely out of that state of mind, right? So that you kind of got to make sure that you're not underwhelming him too much with stuff, right? It's the same deal with dog reactivity. We'll see people say, like, I took my dog for a walk and they started reacting at another dog and I corrected them and they got more intense with it. They're like, it didn't work or it's making it worse. I was like, well, it's not that it didn't work, it's just he didn't care enough about it, right? It's no different than if you're in a frustrated state of mind and somebody's just nagging you and bugging you, you're gonna get more pissed off from that, you know what I mean? So it's the same concept with dogs. So if we're gonna give corrections, I always say corrections are for the purpose of inhibiting behaviors, right? And it's like the taboo talked about thing in the dog world of like, we don't wanna be like causing all this like fear and this and that, but it's like we want these behaviors to just stop, right? We don't wanna have to nag him all the time. So I'm not telling you have it all the way up all the time for everything, but I'm telling you make it count if you're gonna correct for it, you know?